Aruna and friends, it's a privilege to be invited to address this audience on a topic of such outstanding importance. It's also a privilege to be a speaker when Aruna is chairing the meeting. We go back a very long way and have the highest regard and affection for her. The idea that in a society, everybody, irrespective of caste, creed, sex, should be entitled to a certain minimum condition of living is something which has been mooted for a very long time. In the case of Britain, for instance, I know that it was first put forward as a minority report to the Royal Commission on Poor Laws. The minority report was drafted by Beatrice Webb with the assistance of William Beveridge, who later on went on to produce a plan for the welfare state in the 1930s. Beatrice Webb's report actually said that the idea must be to provide sufficient nourishment and training to people when they are young, to provide living, a minimum living condition to people when they are able-bodied, to provide treatment to the sick, and to provide a modest living to those who are old and disabled. And that was basically the way that she visualized a comprehensive system of social security, even in the context of a capitalist society. Obviously, it took a very long time. As I mentioned, it was a minority report. Obviously, the majority at that time had rejected it. It took a very long time in Britain for such a system of social security to actually get implemented. And what is more, it also took a long time, not just temporarily, but it took a substantial change in the correlation of class forces in British society. It took, for instance, the war and the enormous strength the war had brought to the working class politically for this to be implemented. In India, by contrast, we really have no such system, which is very surprising because if you go back, then in 1931 March, the Karachi Congress resolution, which in a sense forms the basis, in my view, of the social contract on the basis of which our modern Indian nation is founded, is something which had already promised to every Indian citizen a minimum level of living. It had said not only political freedoms of various kinds, such as freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, universal adult franchise, free and compulsory primary education, and so on. But it had additionally said that political freedoms don't mean anything unless they are accompanied by economic freedom. And economic freedom was characterized by the fact that every Indian citizen must have a minimum condition of life. Now that is a promise, as I said, on the basis of which the modern Indian nation was founded. In fact, the Karachi Congress resolution in 1931, with emendations later on, were the ones that actually, was the one that actually, in the context of the Great Depression of the 1930s, drew in large masses of people to the freedom struggle. And as you know, the Indian freedom struggle took off in the 1930s. And the first symptom of it was the victory which the Congress got in a number of provincial assembly elections in 1937. And that in a sense was inspired by the kind of confidence that the masses reposed in the Congress because of the social contract on the basis of which the Congress promised to found the modern Indian nation. But of course, it's a fact that post-independence India has seen a remarkable reneging on the social contract, at least when it comes to the parts related to economic freedom. Paradoxically, this also has not generated the kind of opposition and mass movement that should have been there, except of course in the case of old age pensions more recently under the auspices of the pension pension. The idea behind old age pension is to have a non-means related, a non-contributory and universal pension guaranteed to everybody above a certain age, which of course would be a decent, which would assure them a modest but decent standard of living. I think even the argument for having a non-means related and non-contributory pension is an argument which is often not appreciated. Even as significant a document as the Arjun Sendulkar Committee report really did not go as far as demanding this, and of course promised pensions which were extraordinarily modest by the standards of what is required. People may genuinely ask, why should we have a non-means related pension? I mean, after all, pension should be related to the means that a person has. If you are poorer, maybe you should be entitled to more pension than if you are better off. Likewise, why should it be non-contributory? After all, everybody should make some contribution towards the pension. But I think there is a social philosophy underlying the demand for non-means related, non-contributory, universal pension, which maybe very briefly I should go into. And that philosophy basically consists of three propositions. The first proposition is that an individual's material conditions of life are determined not by the individual's capacities or potentials, but by the social arrangements within which the individual lives. If today in the United States we have close to 10% unemployment, that's not because the unemployed are in some sense impaired, not because the unemployed are in some sense people who have disabilities of any kind, but unemployment is a social phenomenon. If it is the case that you actually have in India an enormous amount of poverty, the poverty is not because of the fact that the poor have some faults on their own, but fundamentally it's the outcome of a social arrangement. If it's the fact that you have in any society a tremendous growth of wealth on one hand and poverty on another, that's the outcome of a social arrangement. If the individual's conditions of life are an outcome of a social arrangement, then it follows that if we want to ensure minimum standards of life for everybody, then we have to change the social arrangement. Those who are socialists think in terms of this change in social arrangement in terms of a change in property relations. Those who are not socialists but nonetheless would like a greater move towards egalitarianism, those who are, let us say, interested in social reform, would think of this change as coming about through appropriate fiscal measures on the part of the state. Fiscal measures, if you like, are being, as it were, that end of the spectrum. I mean, in a sense, fiscal intervention is also an intervention in property relations, but it's a much more mild form of intervention in property relations. So there will be some who would argue that fiscal intervention is adequate to ensure a minimum living standard for everybody. There will be others who would argue that this really is something which cannot be achieved by mere fiscal intervention, but requires a change in social arrangement which was much more comprehensive than mere fiscal interventions. Be that as it may, the first proposition of social philosophy which underlies any such demand is a proposition that states that the individual's conditions of life are determined by the social arrangements within which the individual lives. The second proposition is that if it is the social arrangement that determines the individual's conditions of life, in that case, we can actually demand of society certain basic rights. Rights for education, rights for, in fact, the kind of minimum that the Beatrice Webb report was talking about. Rights including for old age pension. The third proposition is that we demand these rights of society not in an adversarial role, but as a part of a fraternity of equals. That basically, if society consists of a fraternity of equals, then it becomes important for society to make such arrangements that everybody in this fraternity of equals enjoys certain rights. Now, if one looks at these three propositions, then it follows that pension as a right, pension as a universal right, is something which has to be guaranteed to everybody as a part of our social arrangement. It is, in fact, a part of the idea of belonging to a fraternity of equals. The moment one thinks in terms of, let's say, kind of, so-and-so is better off, why give him more pension, so-and-so is worse off. Like you have the distinction between BPL, APL in matters of food security. Any such distinction carries with it the notion of a largesse on the part of the state. The notion of the state being kind to some, but of course need not be kind to the others. It does not carry with it the notion of everybody belonging to a fraternity of equals. If everybody belongs to a fraternity of equals, then of course everybody has the same rights and everybody must be treated equally, everybody must have the same access to all the benefits that society provides, and of course, to the extent that people have different means, that should be reflected through how the state raises its resources. The state may raise its resources through a system of progressive taxation, in which case those who have more money pay more taxes compared to those who have less money. But on the other hand, in terms of the rights the individuals have, there should be a complete equality, reflecting, as it were, the fact that as citizens they belong to a fraternity of equals. So the idea of a non-means-related, non-contributory scheme of pensions in which you actually have this being given as a matter of right to everybody and a right that reflects, as it were, that the people belong to a fraternity of equals is something which has to be accepted as a fundamental axiom of social philosophy, and it is this acceptance which had marked, as I said, pre-independence India. This acceptance had marked, for instance, the Karachi Congress resolution of 1931, which actually used a similar terminology. The moment one says this, of course, the immediate question which arises is, can we afford it? Can we actually give all this that you're talking about, that the pension commission is demanding? Very rough calculations would suggest, calculations done by the pension commission would suggest that approximately, if you take a certain age, the age that they have suggested is 55 for men, 50 for women, and 45 for specially underprivileged groups like the tribal population, and so specially excluded groups. In that case, roughly speaking, there may be about 10 crores of population. Even if it's the case that there are some exclusions or some people drop out and so on, you require pensions for about 8 crore people. What is the amount of pension you can think in terms of? Roughly one can approach it in two different ways. The way that the pension commission approaches the issue is that let it be about half of the working wage, in which case we talk about rupees 2,000 rupees a month. Alternatively, you can think in terms of a poverty line, not the way the planning commission describes it, but differently. You can think in terms of what is the level of per capita expenditure at which people satisfy in urban areas 2,100 calories per person per day and in rural areas 2,200. It should be 2,000 which case the figure of rupees 2,000, which is suggested by the pension commission, seems to be an appropriate figure. If you have 8 crores of people, 2,000 rupees per month, in that case, it works out to 192,000 crores, which is roughly about 2% of the GDP. 2% of the GDP in a period in which India supposedly was shining and was having an 8% growth rate per annum. It has come down now, and I'll come to that later on, amounts to the increase, a quarter of the annual increase in per capita, annual increase in GDP. In other words, the GDP increases from year 1 to year 2 by 8%. You simply take 2% of that, and then you would be able to finance a pension scheme. Over a period of time, once you have financed the basic pension scheme, the only additional resource requirement would be to the extent that you find the proportion, to the extent you find the population of pensioners increasing. If the population of pensioners increases roughly at the same rate as the population as a whole, in that case, the drain on per capita income that is there in the initial period, that just continues, there is no further addition to it. To the extent that the population of the pensioners is something which rises a little bit faster, which is the case in our country, it's just this addition which has to be provided, but at any rate, the burden is going to fall over a period of time as a proportion, let us say, of per capita income. There is no need to keep raising this 2% much. Of GDP, there is no need to keep raising this 2% much. I'll come back to these figures in a moment. But fundamentally, then, all it requires is that whatever increase in GDP is taking place in 1 year, you just impound a quarter of it, and of course, that amount you impound every year into the future, and you would be able to maintain a pension scheme, except for the fact that to the extent the proportion of the population consisting of the old increases. The idea of a universal pension is not something which is actually confined only to India. As a matter of fact, there has been, as you know, a systematic literature that has developed in the more recent period demanding a universal pension in the world as a whole. People like Robin Blackburn, for instance, have been in the forefront of that demand. Their argument, of course, is that you take people above 65 in advanced countries, you take people above 60, which is a bit different in the pension commission numbers, in the underdeveloped countries, and you give them $1 a day as pension. Now they have calculated on this basis that about $250 billion would be required in the world to provide a universal pension for the world's population, which they think can be raised by having a 1% Tobin tax and a 2% profits tax. Actually, a 1% Tobin tax plus a 2%, Tobin tax is tax that you have on currency speculations, on currency transactions. So a 1% Tobin tax on the value of currency transactions and a 2% profit tax on all the profits made by multinational corporations would more than exceed the amount that is required to provide a universal pension to the entire population of the world. Of course, above 65 in advanced countries and above 60 in the underdeveloped countries. Therefore, a pension scheme is something which is extremely feasible. It's extremely, it is not only feasible, it's, to my mind, a part of a pledge which was given to our nation in 1931, and therefore there is no reason why we should continue to renege on it, and therefore the demand for a universal, non-means related pension, which is non-contributory, is totally justified. I think if we are thinking in terms of a change in our society, then a very useful point to start with would be precisely that. But of course, pension, while it has been in the forefront because of the demands raised by the pension tradition, is not the only component of social security. As I mentioned, the Beatrice Webb report had mentioned a number of things. It had mentioned, for instance, treatment for the sick. It had mentioned, for instance, training as well as nourishment for the children and so on. Therefore, one can really think in terms not only of pension, which is where we may begin, but one can think in terms of a more comprehensive social security program. That social security program would, of course, have a number of components in a society like ours. It would have, as an important component, free and compulsory primary education, not the way that Kapil Sibal is doing, but through the institutionalization of a chain of neighborhood schools. This is something which happens in the United States. It's not something which is, as it were, particularly radical, because every one of these measures has been implemented in some capitalist country or the other. So free and compulsory primary education through a chain of neighborhood schools run by the state. Secondly, you have to have universal healthcare security through a national health service, not necessarily through this RSPY, whose reach is very limited, whose magnitude is very limited. Thirdly, you have to have the assurance of a certain minimum living wage to all workers, together with guaranteed right to employment, because of course the living wage will be given only to workers, but what about the unemployed? Together with a guaranteed right to employment. And this not only has to be supplemented by the old age pension scheme, but also a scheme of adequate support for the disabled and the handicapped. Many of you may not know that one of the problems, it's not only a question of resources. One of the problems is that in no state in India, with the exception of Kerala, where in the last few years there has been remarkable progress, in no state in India do you actually have any awareness of how many persons there are with disabilities. In other words, this would require, for instance, a team of doctors going from village to village and actually examining those who are disabled and giving them cards. So you can have any amount of legislation providing succor to the disabled, but it means nothing because nobody knows who the disabled are and how much, who therefore is a legitimate claimant on whatever is provided by the state. In Kerala, there was an effort made in the last 2-3 years to actually have teams of doctors going literally from village to village, making out these cards. I don't know to what extent that has been completed, but it was close to completion when I was in Kerala. But the point is that this is something which hasn't been done in any other state. As a result, we let alone have any, we do not even have an idea of how many disabled people there are in India, let alone providing any facilities for them or any support for them or assuring them of rights, which is what we should be doing. Again, when you think in terms of this comprehensive program of social security, immediately the question, 2 questions arise. First question is, can we afford it? Now, I must confess, every time I hear that question, I feel extremely irritated because it's very important to see who this we is. The we, to my mind, typically stands for a privileged upper caste elite, which then dons the mantle of expertise and speaks on behalf of the nation. That can we afford it is something that you can well imagine people belonging to that particular group would be saying. A nation consists of its people, as I said. If people belong to a fraternity of equals, they have rights. Those rights must take precedence over anything that any of the members of the we can talk about in terms of the claims upon the nation's resources. Nonetheless, if you think in terms of some figures, some ideas on it, I just want to put 2 thoughts to you. The first is the following. Suppose we are running a comprehensive national health service as in Britain. Now obviously the expenditures, let's say the nurses here would be getting paid the way the nurses at the same level as the nurses get paid in Britain. The doctors here would be getting paid at the same level the doctors get paid in Britain. A whole range of expenditure that would be undertaken would be expenditures which in terms of magnitude would be more comparable to the expenditures undertaken here rather than the expenditures undertaken there. If that is the case, as a very rough index, one can say that the per capita expenditure on a comprehensive social security scheme in India would be roughly the same proportion of per capita income in India as the per capita expenditure in Britain is the per capita income of Britain. And that's a very rough and ready assumption on which we can begin. If that is the case, then it follows by sheer arithmetic that the proportion of GDP that has to go towards sustaining a comprehensive scheme of social security in India need not be any different from the proportion of GDP that goes to sustain a similar scheme, let us say, in Britain. Let's now look at the resources side. We know that the capacity to raise resources, again, is not determined by whether a country is rich or poor. Fundamentally, the capacity to raise resources for financing such a scheme depends, in a very basic sense, on the proportion of economic surplus to total GDP, the proportion of surplus to total output. And as a proxy for surplus, one can take property incomes. The proportion of property incomes to social output in India is no lower than in any advanced country. Now, if that is the case, of course, India's per capita income is lower, but the proportion of property income, which are a proxy for surplus, is no lower in India than in the advanced capitalist countries. So, the proportion of GDP required for running a comprehensive social security program is no higher than in the rich countries or than in Britain, let us say, and the proportion of surplus which can be mobilized for, or the proportion of GDP that can be mobilized for financing such a program is potentially no lower than in a country like Britain. Then there's no reason why we cannot run a similar social security program. Therefore, the objection to the running of such a program lies not on the grounds of the economic drain that this would imply as far as the country is concerned. But of course, the moment you say this, then another argument is advanced, and that argument would say that, look, the reason we have been having these extraordinarily high growth rates, which talking point of the world, is something which lies in the fact that we actually have provided a whole lot of incentives. If you tax property incomes, then there would not have been the same incentive for investment. Therefore, the property classes would not make the investments which they are currently making, and that being the case, there would be a decline in the growth rate. This makes the requirement of growth rate supersede, as it were, the requirement of social security. For a very long time, it was believed, the argument for supersession of this kind for a very long time would have been the following. It would have been that, look, if you provide social security, all right, you're providing social security, but if you raise the country's growth rate, then the overall resources available to the country increase, then even though today you may be able to provide some social security, allow growth to happen, let growth get maximized, then day after tomorrow you'll be able to have an even larger social security program. Now this is something which of course does not happen automatically. The 11th five-year plan suggested, it argued as follows. It said that if you have a high growth rate, then the nation's overall means increase, therefore the government's capacity to tax away a part of these overall means also increases correspondingly, and as a result, if you just wait till the after tomorrow, then you have a much larger amount of resources available for running a program of social security. If you look at figures, as a matter of fact, precisely during the period when India's GDP growth rate has been high, you find that the tax to GDP ratio has not increased. In other words, In any economy with a progressive taxation, if GDP is growing at 8%, then roughly speaking you should be having tax revenues increasing at 10%, 11%, 12%, whatever, more than 8, and therefore the tax GDP ratio rising. You look at central taxation as a proportion of GDP, it has not increased during this high growth period. You have the state government's taxation, tax revenue, which has not increased. Roughly speaking, in other words, the elasticity of overall central and state tax revenues to GDP has roughly been about 1, which basically means that all this talk about the capacity of the state to raise resources when growth takes place is just talk. Of course, you can still say that, look here, all right, if growth is occurring at 8%, even with a 1 elasticity of at 1, your tax revenue is also rising at 8%. But of course, this growth is of a kind which also makes heavy demands as far as the state is concerned. If you have a growth which is marked by enormous inequalities, then of course you would have an increase in luxury consumption, you would have an increase in private automobiles. If you have an increase in private automobiles, you must have an increase in roads, you must have an increase in overbridges, you must have an increase in all kinds of infrastructure. Then the state gets called upon to undertake those expenditures. Therefore, the trajectory of growth implies on the one hand that the elasticity of tax revenue with respect to GDP does not increase because you provide all kinds of incentives. On the other hand, it also implies that the state gets called upon to undertake all kinds of expenditures. As a result, very little is left for the social security, in the name of which high growth was initially justified. Not only is that, so that being the case, I think this idea that wait till growth happens is an idea which does not stand scrutiny. The idea of giving precedence to growth over social security is something that does not stand scrutiny. There's a second point to it, and that's the last point that I wish to make, and that's the following. That even this growth, which was accompanied, in my view, with worsening absolute poverty, worsening incidence of absolute poverty, is something which is an episode that's over. It was sustained by what I would call a massive bubble. You had inflow of finance coming into the economy that produced a stock market bubble, a speculative stock market bubble that produced what Keynes had called a kind of euphoria as far as investors were concerned, and therefore you had an increase in luxury consumption, you had an increase in investment, and that produced a growth bubble. That bubble has burst, and it's going to be very difficult to revive that bubble in the context of the capitalist crisis that is currently engulfing the world. If that is the case, then no matter how much the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister try to revive that bubble, reprehensible though that revival, if successful, would be, nonetheless they would not even be able to revive that bubble. As you can see, the rupee is declining, therefore the tendency as far as speculative finance is concerned is to leave India rather than to flow into India. Now, in that kind of a situation, therefore, if we are thinking in terms of an alternative growth trajectory, we have to think in terms of an alternative growth trajectory and alternative means of stimulating growth. And this alternative means of stimulating growth would necessarily have to take the form of the state taking the role of enlarging its expenditures, and where else to enlarge expenditures in a more worthwhile manner than in the realm of social security. Therefore, I would suggest that actually we are in India at the moment in a kind of climacteric in which it's possible to think in terms of a new growth trajectory, that can be stimulated through public welfare state measures. If we run after the chimera of the bubbles-led growth of the kind we have had in the past, then neither shall we have growth, nor are we going to have social security. On the other hand, if we actually provide social security as a means of enlarging public expenditures, as a means of recognizing the rights of citizens in a new India, then we shall have both greater social security as well as greater growth. I think this is something which we have to keep in mind. Thank you very much.